Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 16th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maja Changsebiani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative International Education here at Oxford. These seminars are jointly organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. Before introducing our speakers, let me attend to a few administrative points. This webinar is being recorded, as you might have noticed already, and it will be posted online on YouTube in due course. We only record the first half of the webinar, the presentation itself. We won't be recording the Q&A. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or to ask a question. If you want to ask a question or to share your comment, please use the chat function throughout the webinar, okay? Anytime as you listen to the presentation, it's fine to already start posting your questions and comments. When the presentation ends, I will invite you to ask your question yourself. When I invite you to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from, and then share your question or comment. Now, the best parts, let me introduce today's speakers, Julia Paulson and Robin Shields from the University of Bristol. Julia's research focuses on education, peace and conflict. It explores the ways that educational transformation can contribute to peace by seeking to repair past injustices and the educational legacies of conflict and violence. She focuses on the relationships between education and transnational justice, education and memory production, and conducts research on education about difficult pasts, history education, and peace education. Julia has worked on various research projects involving collaborations in Nepal, Peru, Uganda, and Colombia, amongst many other countries. Julia is a member of the editorial board of Compare, one of the key journals in our field in comparative education. Also, she's a member of editorial boards of research in international and comparative education and global social challenges. In the School of Education at the University of Bristol, she is co-director of the Center of Comparative and International Research in Education and teaches on the Masters in Policy and International Development and on the BSc in Education Studies and supervises doctoral students. Robin Shields' research focuses on the globalization of education, understood very broadly. He's particularly interested in applying new forms of quantitative data collection and analysis to the study of global trends and processes in education. Robin has written about globalization and education, including higher education internationalization, climate change in higher education, international aid to education, technology and education in conflict-affected contexts. He has worked on a number of externally funded projects, including he has had funded projects from ESRC, Higher Education Academy, and Leadership Foundation for Higher Education. One of his recent projects examined school management, accountability, and learning outcomes in Mumbai and Kathmandu. Robin is co-editor of Comparative Education Review, another central journal in our field, and has served on the executive committee of the British Association of International and Comparative Education. Julia and Robin will speak about a fascinating topic today. The presentation is titled Toppling Statues, Complicity, Whiteness and Reckoning in Comparative and International Education. Floor is yours. I look forward to hearing your presentation together with a very large number of participants, almost 60 people in the room.
Thank you, Maja. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here and for taking the time to come and share these ideas with us. We're really looking forward to the discussion. Maja, thank you for the kind invitation and introduction. We will get started. So, as a couple of words of introduction, with this paper that Robin and I have been working on for over a year, we're trying to bring together two kind of sets of observations and discussions that we've been having and that we started to notice there were parallels between. So a first is, as residents of Bristol and academics based at the University of Bristol, we witnessed the toppling of the statue of the traitor and enslaved peoples, Edward Colston, in the summer of 2020 as part of Black Lives Matter. demonstrations. And we were also aware that this was one part of a decades-long struggle led primarily by Afro-Caribbean, Black and African heritage communities and activist groups in Bristol to work through official channels to try to remove the statue, and also to try to instigate dialogue and remove mention of Colston in other spaces in our city, including in road names, in the names of cultural institutions, and in the logo of the University of Bristol, where Colston's crest still remains, it's worth saying. So we were aware of that long-standing history to try to spark change in the city of Bristol around Colston's legacy, and also of the way that that dialogue and discussion and struggle changed after the statue came down. So including sparking a lot of discussion within the university and renewed efforts to try to change the logo, which are ongoing. So that's one side of what we're interested in discussing in this paper around monuments and statues and contested heritage. The other thing that we were witnessing was the emergence of two increasingly polarized positions potentially around history and the role of the history of our discipline in the field of comparative and international education. And so we're bringing together those two sets of interests into this paper, where we develop arguments around comparative and international education as a space potentially of white flight. So I'll just quickly talk you through what we will do in the presentation. The first thing is to develop these two competing and increasingly polarized perspectives on the history of the field and its entanglements with colonial and racist histories, which I'll hand over to Robin to do in a second. Then we'll present some theoretical tools, particularly around white ignorance, around the management of memory, around white public space, and around whiteness and affect that help us to make sense of this polarization and help us to raise the question of whether comparative and international education could be described as a space of white flight. And then we'll come back to some concluding thoughts around what these debates mean, not just about our past and history as a field and discipline, but about the future and present of the field, and how we as white researchers or researchers racialized as white, who learned the dominant histories of comparative and international education that Robin will review in a second, and now are in positions where we teach about comparative and international education, and also where we sit in gatekeeping roles, like Maya mentioned, on editorial boards of journals and in directorships of research centers, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to think about our roles as well in responding to these debates around the histories of comparative and international education, and how we might respond more fruitfully and teach histories in the present and future.
Great. So thank you, everyone, for coming. It's great to see you. I'm going to start our analysis by outlining these two competing perspectives that understand coloniality and its racist underpinnings differently within the field of comparative and international education. It's worth saying from the outset that these two perspectives emerge through our own analysis. So they're not groups of scholars necessarily working together. They don't identify as two perspectives, but rather we've read a body of literature and can see two different points of view. In some cases, there's direct discussions between these points of view. In other cases, it's more indirect conversations, tacit differences that emerge in the literature. We'll start the first by kind of a seminal piece in the field as we see it. It's the publication of a 2016 special issue of the journal Comparative Education Review. It's called Contesting Coloniality: Rethinking Knowledge Production and Circulation in Comparative and International Education. Now, it's worth mentioning that this is volume 61 of Comparative Education Review. And until this issue, the editor of every single issue that was published, all 61 previous volumes, had been a white male without exception. So this, for the first point, was a turning point in a way in the journal's history, in the diversity of editorship, of authorship, and of the views that they expressed. In this special issue, authors wrote about their experiences as scholars of color, the ways in which comparative and international education is implicated in relationships of coloniality and its racist underpinnings. It's one of the most highly, so the introduction, which was called Towards a Post-Colonial Comparative and International Education, was actually the most highly cited work in the journal, or a highly cited article in the journal that year. And we've presented here a key quote from its opening. The editors and authors of the introduction say, "We have put together this special issue to initiate dialogue about the active colonial legacies within the field of comparative and international education. We hope readers will join us in a major rethinking of the norms and knowledge about difference, comparison, and research that have been inherited from the field's history." So there's a few key terms that stand out to us there. The first is it's about active colonial legacy. So it's not just about trying to unpick what happened in the past, but it's about what it means for the field today. The second is that it's about initiating dialogue and thinking. So there's an opening for discussion rather than a presentation of a final viewpoint. And the third, that the presence of history, even though it's about active legacies, the presence of history is important. In the introduction, they go on to present an analysis of Isaac Kandel, who's often recognized as a key figure in the history of comparative and international education. They showed that through his work for Teachers College of Columbia and its International Institute, Kandel supported imperial projects of the United States at the time. They quote him, for example, as saying, "The civilized world is gradually extending its boundaries, and the significance of educating vast millions of people who have hitherto been isolated and content with their own customs, traditions, and occupations is being realized." So Kandel saw the role of education and his role at Teachers College as supporting this civilizing project through American imperialism, for example, in places such as Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. We see this as kind of a seminal or a key turning point in the field. It has inspired other work. So for example, we have Suzanne Ress, who's written about race in South-South cooperation and the importance of understanding racial politics in South-South cooperation. Keita Takayama's gone on to write more about Isaac Kandel and Paul Monroe as key figures in the field and their entanglements with American imperialism. And Walters and Jansen recently have written about the durability of racial thinking and racial pseudoscience in South African higher education. Equally, this work, this seminal work, builds upon other key authors in the field who have laid out similar arguments before. We cite Leon Tickley and Sheila Trehar as authors who have done work in that field. And of course, it builds on post-colonial arguments from other fields and disciplines. So the second perspective seems to us to reject some of the reflections and assertions made in the first one. It, in turn, asserts a stronger disciplinary identity, which is overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. An example of this second perspective is in Edward Vickers' article, Critiquing Coloniality. He specifically references the special issue in its introduction in great depth. He argues that it engages in, quote, virulent identity politics, in which positionality becomes a certificate of victimhood, granting its holders a privileged voice with damaging consequences for civility. Now, there's a few key terms there. The first is that Vickers rejects the idea of positionality as a legitimate discourse in comparative and international education. He says it risks dividing the field, and instead we should try to unify so that we can address pressing global challenges. This is interesting because I think by this point, by 2020, positionality had been mainstreamed in many other areas of educational research and social research. So you can go back to kind of Sandra Harding's work, for example, from the 1990s. It talks about standpoint theories and positionality, and you can see how often it's been used in other educational publications, which makes this argument quite remarkable that within the field of CIE, still in 2020, this is seen as kind of contentious and a debatable field. So that's the first point. The second, like Kandel, Vickers talks about civility, which of course has a strong connotation or link to the civilized world or civilization. This is accompanied by or kind of echoes other arguments about whiteness as a civilizing mission and colonialism as being about kind of a racial uplift project, that it will make colonize people's lives better by making them essentially more white. Vickers doesn't say that, but the concern for civility and the risk that we will not be civil or civilized if we engage with this discourse is kind of underneath the surface there. Another reflection on this piece is from Erwin Epstein's article in the CIES newsletter, which again talks about the special issue in its introduction in great depth. He notes that, quote, facile dismissals of the work of lionized figures in the field is the result of unbalanced historiography and a disregard for the particular historical context of the time in which they wrote. So Epstein's making a valid point that these authors were, Kandel and Monroe, for example, reflected the norms of their time just like anyone else. And perhaps we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, because they might have made some very valuable contributions to the field. He says to do so would be much like disregarding Thomas Jefferson's contributions to liberty in the US and beyond, simply because he was the beneficiary of enslaved Africans on his estate at the time. Now, this seems appealing in some respects. Again, Jefferson was conforming to the law at the time. He was under the US law, he was entitled to do so, but it's also ignoring alternative histories or arguments that could be presented. There were active abolitionist movements at the time. There were many people who did not enslave other people in order to perpetuate their wealth. So he's providing a very partial account of Thomas Jefferson as a liberalizing force. He's also negating the contributions of many others, particularly Black Americans who actively resisted slavery and who fought for liberty for many generations. So it's a very partial history. In reading these two perspectives, you might hear echoes of wider discussions, wider contemporary discussions. So for example, Epstein talks about the special issue as engaging in cancel culture, that it's trying to cancel trying to cancel Isaac Kandel and Monroe just because they reflected the norms of their time. It's hard to read Vickers' certificate of victimhood without hearing the term snowflakes, which is often used to disparage people of color who talk about the marginalization that they've experienced. So you see these wider discussions, much like we're accompanying the toppling of the statue, playing out within the field of comparative and international education. This second perspective is reinforced by a few recently published histories of comparative and international education. They approach the field by presenting biographies of who they call notable comparativists. So the first is North American scholars of comparative education, examining the work and influence of notable 20th century comparativists. And the second is about British notable, quote unquote, notable comparativists. So these notable scholars, it's worth mentioning from the outset, are of course, or as you might expect, overwhelmingly white men. The introductions do point out that this was kind of the norm at the time, that higher education was mainly occupied by white men. And so this is just reflecting the composition of the field as it emerged, possibly naturally to the editors of the discipline, or the editors of the books. They talk about Kandel and Monroe in the North American volume in some depth. So they're the subjects of chapter 2 and chapter 3. It's worth mentioning they don't talk about Puerto Rico or Hawaii or the Philippines or any other projects of American colonialism. So it's a somewhat partial, somewhat limited analysis, we would argue. And there's very little dialogue here between the two perspectives we're analyzing. So we could see Vickers engaging with the special issue and Epstein to some extent. Here we have more kind of parallel lines that don't have as much engagement as you might expect. Both works have a very celebratory tone. So their goal is kind of, it seems, to exalt great founding fathers of the field. For example, the chapter on Isaac Kandel in the North American book says no figure in the 20th century did more to advance the field of comparative and international education than Isaac Kandel. We were also particularly interested in the chapter on Nicholas Hans in the British Scholars edition. Nicholas Hans was an academic and researcher in comparative and international education at King's College London. Cowan's chapter on Hans says his treatment of race is very much based on British anthropology of the period, and it's embarrassingly bad. Those were Cowan's words, and that was interesting to us. So we went to look at Hans' original work, and it's interesting that it's actually the first chapter of his book on comparative education, what he calls the racial problem. And he talks about how for colonized peoples, people who were subject to European colonialism, the main problem facing white colonists was to associate the people that they had colonized with European civilization and gradually to raise them to a higher social level. So like Kandel, Hans saw education as an important part of a civilizing mission, and arguably is very much linked to Vicker's wish for what he calls a civilized field today, one in which racial differences are not acknowledged. Cowan is right that it's based on British anthropology of the period, but we found the language of embarrassingly bad questionable and something to reflect upon. If one wishes to exalt Hans, to celebrate him, if that's the goal of the book, then certainly this is embarrassing. It will detract from one's ability to do so. If one is perhaps of a heritage associated with the colonized peoples, as one is a scholar of color in the field of comparative and international education, we could understand that this would not be embarrassingly bad, but could be alienating. It could be very exclusionary language and is much more serious and embarrassing in many respects. So having presented these two different perspectives, I'm going to hand over to Julia, who will talk about our conceptual analysis of them.
Thanks, Robin. So a first set of conceptual tools that helps us make sense of some of the ways that the history of comparative and international education is narrated in the books and in the responses and newsletters, etc., that Robin has shared with us, comes from work around epistemologies of ignorance, which has been developed in dialogue between philosophers of race and feminist epistemologists. So here, scholars are urging us not just to pay attention to the conditions that make knowledge possible, which much of epistemology and philosophical epistemology explores, but also to attend to the conditions that enable or sustain not knowing or ignorance. And so a defining feature of ignorance viewed in this way is that it's not merely seen as an absence of knowledge or an area where we haven't yet had a chance to study or expand our facts and knowledge, but as a force all of its own that blocks knowledge, that stands in place of knowledge, and that tacitly or more explicitly affirms a need or a commitment not to know, to quote Lorraine Code. So from this angle, ignorance isn't simply something lacking in the knowledge that we have, but it can become a structure that's created and maintained and plays an important role in determining how we see and apprehend the world. So ignorance becomes a substantive epistemic practice that differentiates the dominant group, to quote Linda Martin-Elkoff. Charles W. Mills, who works specifically on white ignorance in the United States and also globally, describes the substantive epistemic practice of white ignorance, which he defines as the positive interest that white people have in seeing the world wrongly. So in exploring the workings of maintaining, or of knowledge in maintaining white supremacy, Mills explains that white ignorance enables a blindness to and denial of the long history of structural discrimination that leaves white people in the US in his analysis and advantaged groups more generally in other analyses with differential resources that they have today and the consequent advantages in negotiating opportunity structures. So violent histories are silenced and their enduring legacies are left unseen by dominant groups through what Mills calls the management of memory. And part of this management of memory includes how history is narrated, celebrated, taught, and returned to, including, we will argue, in the disciplinary histories of fields. So these ideas are helpful for us in understanding the predominance of a single way of narrating the field of comparative and international education, which Robin has outlined. It's also helpful in seeing and understanding how and why histories of colonialism, racism, and other entanglements with oppression are elided or sidelined in those histories, so that this is embarrassing moving on, when in fact, this is the first chapter of the book that goes on to interact and inform the other ideas about education and how to understand and engage in it that follow within Hans's book, is part of this management of memory. And these ideas also help us to understand the fight back, to use Mills's words, that we see when dominant histories, in this case of comparative and international education, are questioned. So a second set of tools that helps us to make sense of our field is this idea of comparative and international education as a space of white flight. So we came to this idea as we were discussing the fact that race and racism can constitute fairly major themes in other areas of educational research. But they haven't been major themes for research in comparative and international education. And in trying to wonder why, we read around in other disciplines and were quite inspired by a study that Brodkin and colleagues did in anthropology over 10 years ago that came to the conclusion that, or started to describe anthropology as a discipline as a white public space. So the authors were interested in the disconnect that they saw within anthropology, where there were rising numbers of doctorates and doctoral researchers of color finishing PhDs in anthropology, but remaining underrepresented in permanent tenured academic jobs, and also being burdened with a racialized division of labor, where they were responsible for doing all of the diversification and the questioning the history of the field and the working to make the field a more welcoming space for scholars of color and scholars of other underrepresented and marginalized backgrounds. So they described this tension around an increasingly diversifying field that was inducting people into an effectively white public space. And we thought this was interesting to think about for comparative and international education, but we also wondered about extending the concept of space, given that comparative and international education actively conceptualizes itself as a subfield. And so we thought, what does it mean to be a subfield? And is this a space of intellectual migration that's been enabled through the intentional and careful construction of this subfield? So by forming this distinct identity of comparative and international education that's different from education, and that is shaped by particular approaches and questions, particular methodologies, arguably a tacit complicity in technocratic development projects that are largely oblivious to histories of colonialism, in crafting this identity and setting up borders and boundaries around it, comparative and international education has provided a comfortable space for scholars to engage in colorblind scholarship that ignores racial politics, processes of racialization, racism, and colonial histories in the contexts where research is carried out, despite the fact that we are often engaged in post-colonial contexts and in research contexts with colonial histories. Also, the continued forms of introspection, historical narration, and self-celebration, again, which we've seen in the perspectives that Robin has laid out, reinforce these boundaries and this process of flight towards a leafy, affluent, comfortable suburb, arguably, which we describe think about possibly describing our field as in the paper. And this effectively redlines race and racism as concerns for researchers and topics that must be considered when thinking about how context matters, for example, in the national context that we explore. Further calls to avoid dividing the field, like the one that Robin presented from Vickers, by avoiding discussions of positionality, can also be seen to consolidate these boundaries of white flight and to kind of put the neighborhood sensibilities for this suburb that we're arguably operating within. Finally, we work with ideas of whiteness and affect to help to explain some of the defensiveness that we see in the response to what is an invitation for dialogue that the editors of the special issue that Robin introduced put forward. It wasn't an invitation to dismantle and deconstruct our field as a whole. It was an invitation to revisit our histories and to think about the legacies of injustice within our field. But the defensive nature with which it's been received can be explained in some ways by these theories around whiteness and affect. So Emily Beausoleil has been working to understand where that rush to defensiveness comes from when dominant groups are faced with claims of structural injustice and faced with having to reckon with the the ways in which they've been advantaged by structural injustice, which we could arguably see playing out in our field with the 60 issues edited solely by white men, for example, that Robin mentioned, possibly. And Beausoleil does some really fascinating work around listening and around attending to the discomfort that arises and that rush to defensiveness that dominant individuals from dominant groups might engage in. And just in that act of listening, space might be open for dialogue because dominant voices might not be jumping straight in to spark things off. We were also really interested in the theorization around affect within the recent book, Learning Whiteness by Arathi Sriprakash and colleagues, where in addition to discussing the material and epistemic processes through which whiteness is learned and sustained, they attend to affect and emotions and the affective states and emotions that whiteness produces and naturalizes. So they're talking about learning whiteness in settler colonial Australia, and they describe feeling states that the settler colonial state generates and how the state maintains feelings of happy benevolence and homeliness as myths of inclusiveness and happy multiculturalism. So at the same time as the state is projecting this feeling of inclusion and benevolence and friendliness, which all come through in some of the defenses of the field of comparative and international education as well. How could you challenge this friendly field? But at the same time, the state is able to project itself as wounded and fragile, in need of protection and defense from any attacks that reveal the lies behind its happy benevolence, that challenge that maintenance of an ignorance to histories of oppression. So these feelings map onto individuals and social relations in the context of settler colonial Australia and help to explain how the future of whiteness is constantly in the process of securing itself through anxious and defensive ongoing educational and pedagogical projects. And these are helpful insights to understand whiteness in comparative and international education, with examples of woundedness, defensiveness, and fragility in the responses to critiques of the founding narratives of the field. And it's useful to ask, I think, whether similar feeling states are at play in the defense of lionized figures and the rejection of invitations to dialogue as challenges to civility.
So having presented our analysis, we find ourselves in a place or a situation very much like the city of Bristol after the toppling of the Colston statue. What do we do with the statue? What do we do with the plinth where it used to stand? Do we leave the statue in the harbour? Some people said we should put it right back where it used to be and throw the people who toppled it into jail. What do we do? You can see both of those viewpoints kind of present in the field. So in trying to reason through this, we drew upon the work of Joanna Birch-Brown, who does research on contested heritage. And she contrasts the removal of contested heritage with the alternative of keeping it in place as part of truth-telling and acknowledgement, as a pedagogical tool for vividly teaching the history in question. So it's between cancelling and removing and keeping in place with celebration, we find some kind of ground that allows us to recontextualize the past. This might be useful for the field of comparative and international education, and it might be a very productive discussion for it to have. We note that it's not unique in fields in the university in terms of its entanglements with racism and colonialism. In fact, many fields are arguably much worse. The field of statistics, for example, has deep implications in that eugenics and calls for racial superiority and racial violence were prevalent among many well-known founders of the field whose tests are kind of used and whose names are uttered daily by people who do work with things like correlation, for example. We'll always talk about Pearson's correlation coefficient. Pearson advocated the violent oppression and removal of non-white populations. So in some ways, we're at an easier starting point, I would say, than other fields, and it might be a good tone or a good example to set. When we have this discussion, we want to probably avoid the dichotomy that Birch-Brown identifies between cancel culture, where we say, which is really a caricature of the critique, that's saying it's trying to completely remove the past, to destroy the field, etc. No one has actually said that. There is no cancel culture. We want to equally avoid kind of the continued veneration of lionized notable people, where we just constantly incant to recite the same narratives about their wonderful past, tell the stories about what they did without really any critical analysis that we should be providing as academics in the work that we do.
Yeah, and we just have a couple final points around potential promising avenues, I think, around alternative narratives and expanded narratives of the history of comparative and international education, including the work that Takayama has done that Robin mentioned around a more honest accounting, perhaps, of Candle's contributions and work. I forgot to mention on one of the slides, we put up a recent blog by Elena Unterhalter and Moses Okech, where they're looking at the entanglements of the research center that they lead in UCL and its active engagement in colonial projects. And in acknowledging that and offering that alternative history, they're not shutting down the discipline or, they're just canceling the center. They're just honestly engaging in an exploration of its past. And I think this attention to honest engagement with disciplinary paths, and also to attending to and trying to find histories and figures and education processes and practices that weren't narrated by the lionized figures, but nonetheless were there and might give us a wider and more exciting historical understanding of education in the period would be useful, and it would align with ideas around reparative histories that are looking into contingencies and alternative and untold or silenced histories. We're also really interested in emerging work around constructive complicity, including by a recent book by Joseph Salisbury, and I can't remember the first name of Connolly. No, Joseph Salisbury is a certain, anyways. Work around constructive complicity that's looking at ways in which scholars can acknowledge their situatedness within institutions, research centers, in the case of Elaine and Moses's exploration, fields and disciplines, as we're highlighting for comparative and international education, that are complicit in various processes of injustice and oppression, and then to work within their positionings and the ways that they embody and hold power within those institutions to try to find ways to dismantle or at least draw attention to that complicity. So this is another way perhaps of thinking around positionality that thinks about connections to power perhaps a bit more explicitly. And we just want to conclude with the reminder, very important from memory studies, that while we've been discussing a lot of the histories of the field and discipline in the presentation thus far, the struggles that we see in that defensiveness of the predominant historical narrative of comparative and international education are really, we think, less about the facts of that historical past and much more about the struggle to define and shape the discipline in the present and future. And therefore, we hope that there are ways that that can happen that are more dialogic and more honest with historical accounts as well. So we're excited to hear questions from you all, and thanks so much for your attention.
I'll stop the share so we can have a